The city of Midtown was a place of clean sidewalks and old brick buildings, where people liked to think things were fair. At the heart of it was the 12th District Courthouse, a big stone building that felt heavy and serious. Inside, one courtroom moved faster than all the others. This was Judge Everett Harrington's kingdom. Judge Harrington was a man who believed in order. He was in his late 50s, with hair so perfectly silver it looked like a picture. He wore colorful bow ties every day, little splashes of red or green against his black robe. People said he ran his courtroom like a tight ship. And he did. But if you watched long enough, you started to see the cracks in the paint. To some folks who came before him, the judge could be almost kind. If a young white man was in trouble for a fight, Judge Harrington might lean forward, his voice softening. "Son," he'd say, "you look like you come from a good family. This isn't you. I want you to do better." He'd give probation, a fine, a second chance. The lawyers would nod. The families would weep with relief. But for others, the air in the room changed. When a black or Latino defendant stood before him, the judge's friendliness vanished. His back would straighten, his eyes would turn cold and bored. The same crime, a stolen car, a shoplifting charge, would suddenly sound much worse when he described it. His sentences were longer, his lectures were harsher. "You people need to learn respect for the law," he might say, his voice like ice. The public defenders, overworked and tired, would try to argue, but he'd cut them off. "Don't waste my time, counselor. The evidence is clear." It was a quiet, ugly secret everyone in the building knew. The clerks would sometimes share looks when a certain kind of name was called. The bailiffs would shift their weight, staring straight ahead. But who could prove it? The judge was powerful. He played golf with the mayor's friends. He gave speeches about law and order. His conviction rate was the highest in the district. On paper, he was a star. Off paper, in a quiet office building a few blocks away, a different kind of file was being built. For months, the FBI had been getting whispers. Not one big crime, but a pattern, a sickness in the system. People who felt crushed by the judge's gavel had started talking to federal investigators. They called the investigation Operation Gavelfall. They had statistics, they had stories, but they needed something solid. They needed to hear the man's own words, to prove he was purposely breaking the law because of the color of a person's skin. They needed a way inside his chambers, where he thought no one was listening. That's where the agent came in. Let's call him Ray. Ray wasn't like the agents in the movies. He was calm, the kind of calm that comes from seeing a lot. Before he was FBI, he was a prosecutor himself, so he knew exactly how a courtroom worked. He knew how judges thought. He had a wife and 2 kids who thought he was away on a long, boring financial audit. The few friends who knew the truth worried for him. To become someone else. Ray had to change everything. He got a haircut that was just a little uneven. He wore clothes that were clean but worn, bought from a discount store. He practiced walking with less confidence, dropping his shoulders just a bit. He created a whole life for his new self. A small-time financial advisor who'd cut corners, who was in a little over his head. They gave him a fake record, a trail of minor, believable mistakes. The plan was dangerous. Ray would be alone in a room with a powerful, angry man who had the legal right to put him in jail. One wrong word, one moment where he sounded too smart or too calm, and the judge would get suspicious. The whole investigation would blow up. Judge Harrington would be warned, and he'd cover his tracks forever. The day of the first hearing, Ray felt a cold knot in his stomach. He sat in the hard wooden bench in the public gallery, waiting for his fake name to be called. He watched Judge Harrington work. He saw the switch flip. He saw a young white kid get a sympathetic talk and community service. Right after, he saw a black man about his own age, charged with the same thing, get a scowl and a jail sentence. Seeing it up close, in person, made the knot in Ray's stomach turn to heat. This was real. This man was ruining lives from behind a polished wooden bench. Finally, the clerk called, "Case number 1147, State versus," and gave Ray's alias. Ray stood up. He walked through the little gate, his steps measured, his eyes down. He could feel the judge's gaze land on him, a quick, dismissive scan. He stood next to his court-appointed lawyer, another FBI agent playing her part perfectly. She looked nervous, overmatched. Judge Harrington shuffled his papers. "Counselor," he said to the prosecutor. "The facts." The prosecutor, who was not in on the operation, gave a quick rundown of the fake fraud charge. A few $1,000s, a small business. It was the kind of case that usually ended in a fine or probation. Harrington turned his eyes to Ray. They were pale blue and held no warmth. "And how does your client plead?" Ray's lawyer spoke up, her voice thin. "Not guilty, Your Honor. We would request a trial date." The judge almost sighed. He looked at Ray again, a longer look this time. It was a look that said, "I know your type. You're wasting my time." "Very well," Harrington said, his voice flat. "Pretrial conference is set for 3 weeks from today, in my chambers. We'll see if we can't clear this up before it clogs my courtroom." He said it like Ray was a piece of garbage stuck in a drain. The gavel banged. Ray turned and walked out, the hidden wire against his skin feeling heavier than it did before. Part 1 was over. He was on Harrington's radar. Now he had to get invited into the lion's den. The private chambers where the real deals were made, and where the judge, they hoped, would finally show his true self. The real test was coming. The 3 weeks between the first hearing and the meeting in the judge's chambers felt like a lifetime. For the agent, let's keep calling him Ray, it was a strange kind of waiting. He had to live in his new skin, think like his new character, a man worried about a future that was actually just a story. He'd catch himself walking through a store, practicing how his alias would stand, how he'd avoid looking people in the eye too long. At home with his real family, he had to shut all that away, which was the hardest part. His little girl would ask why he seemed tired, and he'd just smile and say work was boring. The lie felt heavy. Meanwhile, in his big office at the courthouse, Judge Harrington barely gave the case another thought. To him, it was just another file, another minor nuisance cluttering his docket. He'd seen the defendant. He'd made his quick assessment. The man was just another face in a long line of faces he believed were always looking for a handout, always trying to beat the system. He filed Ray's case away in his mind under "to be dealt with quickly." He had a charity golf tournament to plan for. The day of the pretrial conference arrived. It was a Tuesday, with a slow, drizzling rain that made the courthouse windows look smeared. Ray met his lawyer, the FBI agent playing the part, on a bench downstairs. She was a serious woman with a sharp mind, and today she looked perfectly nervous, clutching a fake file folder too tightly. "Remember," she said softly, not looking at him, "you're scared. You're in over your head. You want this to go away, but you're not a pushover. You're unsure. Let him steer, but don't agree too fast. We need him to push." Ray nodded, adjusting his jacket. The wire was there, a tiny, silent witness sewn into the lining. He could feel it, a slight stiffness near his ribs. It wasn't just a microphone. It was the whole case. His heart was beating a steady, loud rhythm in his ears. They took the elevator up, the silence heavy between them. The hall outside Judge Harrington's chambers was quiet, just the muffled sound of typing from a clerk's office. The judge's personal secretary, a woman who had worked for him for 20 years, gave them a thin, uninterested smile. "Go on in. He's expecting you." The door to the chambers was thick, dark wood. Ray's lawyer knocked, and a voice from inside said, "Enter." Judge Harrington's chambers weren't like the cold courtroom. They were warm, paneled in dark wood, and smelled of old books and lemon polish. Sunlight struggled through the rainy window behind a massive, neat desk. The judge wasn't wearing his robe. He had on a crisp white shirt and one of his signature bow ties, this one a deep blue. He looked more like a college professor than a judge, but his eyes were the same, cool and measuring. He didn't stand up. "Sit," he said, gesturing to 2 leather chairs in front of his desk. He was looking over some papers, making them wait a moment, a little power play. Finally, he set them down and leaned back, steepling his fingers. "So," he began, looking directly at Ray's lawyer, but his words aimed at Ray. "We're here to talk about your client's future. A fraud charge. Not enormous, but not trivial either." He shifted his pale blue eyes to Ray. You understand the charges? Ray made himself meet the gaze for a second, then looked down at his hands. I do, sir, he said, keeping his voice quiet, a little rough. The state's case is solid, Harrington said, though he hadn't really looked at it. He was talking from a script he used every day. Your client has a history. A jury sees a man with a past, accused of dishonesty. It's not a good look. Ray's lawyer cleared her throat. Your Honor, my client maintains his innocence. We believe there are issues with how the evidence was. Harrington held up a hand, cutting her off. He didn't like being disagreed with, especially not here in his own office. Counselor, save it for the jury, if you get that far. He turned his attention fully to Ray now, like the lawyer was just furniture. Let me be blunt with you, son. This is the crossroads. You go to trial, you roll the dice. And with your record, those dice are loaded. You're looking at 7, maybe 10 years in a state prison. You know what that's like for a man like you? The phrase, a man like you, hung in the air. It meant nothing and everything. The room felt smaller. Ray made himself look confused, worried. I just don't think it's fair to go to prison for something I didn't fully. Fair. The judge gave a short, dry laugh. It wasn't a happy sound. This isn't about fair. This is about the law. And the law says you're in a deep hole. He leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. I'm offering you a ladder. Today. Right now. You plead guilty to a misdemeanor. A lesser charge. You get time served, which is just the few hours you were booked, and 3 years of probation. You walk out of this courthouse today. You go home. It was a bully's deal. Swap a major felony for a slap on the wrist, but you have to say you're guilty to a crime you didn't commit. The pressure was a physical thing, a weight pushing down on Ray's shoulders. He had to play this right. But, a guilty plea? Ray said, shaking his head slightly. That stays on my record. I can't get a good job with that. Harrington's patience was thinning. His friendly pretense was slipping. Your record is already a problem, he said, his voice growing harder. You're not in a position to bargain. You think a jury of 12 people from this city is going to believe you over a respected business owner? Use your head. Ray's lawyer tried again, her voice trembling just right. Your Honor, we need time to consider the offer. To discuss. The offer is for now, Harrington snapped. His composure was cracking, revealing the impatience and the arrogance beneath. He was used to being obeyed. You leave this room, the deal is gone. This trial. And I will personally see to it that the sentencing guidelines are applied to their fullest extent. He stared right at Ray, his eyes cold and certain. I promise you, the full weight of this court will come down. I'll make certain of it. The threat was clear. It was no longer about the evidence. It was about him, his power, his will. He was telling Ray that if he didn't do what he was told, the judge would make him pay, not because of the law, but because he dared to say no. Ray let the silence stretch. He looked at his hands, then at his lawyer, who gave a tiny, helpless shrug. He let the fear show on his face, the defeat. He swallowed hard, like a man tasting something bitter. I don't want to go to prison, he whispered. A satisfied look flickered across Judge Harrington's face. He'd won. He'd broken another one. He leaned back, the pleasant mask trying to slip back on, but the victory in his eyes was ugly. Smart man, he said, his voice smooth again. Your lawyer will draw up the paperwork. We'll do the formal plea in open court tomorrow morning. 10 sharp. Don't be late. The meeting was over. Ray stood up, his legs feeling weak not from real fear, but from the effort of holding everything in. He didn't look at the judge again. He just followed his lawyer out of the warm, wood-paneled room, back into the cool, empty hallway as the heavy door clicked shut behind them. Ray took a slow, quiet breath. The tiny wire against his skin felt warm. It had heard everything. The bullying, the threat, the cold promise of ruin from a man in a bow tie. They had it. Now they just had to go through one more act, the final, painful performance in the courtroom tomorrow, where he would have to stand up and call himself guilty, just to make the story real for the one man who needed to believe he'd won. The night after the meeting in the judge's chambers was a long one. Ray didn't sleep much. Lying in his own bed, in the quiet dark of his real life, his mind kept playing back the judge's words on a loop. The full weight of this court will come down. The cold certainty in the man's voice. It wasn't just acting for Ray anymore. He'd met men like Harrington before, men who wore authority like a weapon, who believed their own power made them right. Thinking about all the people who didn't have a hidden wire, who had stood in that same spot and been crushed by that weight, made it hard to close his eyes. This was why he'd taken the job. The next morning, the courthouse felt different. The same people rushed down the same marble halls, but today, Ray was walking toward a finish line. He met his lawyer in a small, windowless attorney meeting room. She handed him a cup of bad coffee. "Playback is crystal," she said, a hint of a real smile touching her lips for the first time. "The texts were up all night. It's all there. The threat is unambiguous." She looked at him, her professional mask softening for a second. "You ready to stick the landing?" Ray nodded, sipping the bitter coffee. "Just want it to be over. That makes two of us. Remember in there," she said, nodding toward the courtroom. "You're a defeated man. You agreed because you felt you had no choice. Because you were scared. That's the truth he needs to see." At 5 minutes to 10, they walked into Judge Harrington's courtroom. It was busy. The public gallery was half full with other people waiting for their turn. Their faces painted with worry, boredom, or emptiness. The air smelled of old wood and floor polish. Ray took his seat at the defense table, his back to the crowd. He could feel the eyes on him, just another guy in trouble. He kept his shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the empty judge's chair high up on its platform. Judge Harrington entered with a theatrical flourish. The bailiff called out, "All rise!" And everyone stood as the judge swept in, his black robe flowing, his silver hair perfect. He gave the room a quick, dismissive glance, like a king surveying his land, before sitting down. He looked rested, pleased. It was just another day of business. They waded through a few other cases first. A woman pleading for a restraining order. A young man in a too-big suit for a traffic violation. Ray watched Harrington, studying him. With the white woman, he was patiently polite. With the young man, who was white but clearly poor, he was impatient and sarcastic. The pattern was so clear it was almost brazen. Then the clerk called Ray's case. Ray and his lawyer stood and approached the bench. Harrington looked down at them, a faint, almost imperceptible smile on his lips. He was in control. He had solved another problem. "Good morning," the judge said, his voice carrying through the quiet room. "I understand the parties have reached a disposition?" The prosecutor, the one who wasn't in on the secret, stood up. "Yes, Your Honor. The state has offered, and the defendant has agreed to, a plea to the lesser included misdemeanor charge of attempted fraud in the 3rd degree. The agreed-upon sentence is time served and 36 months of supervised probation." Harrington turned his gaze to Ray's lawyer. "Counsel for the defense, is that your understanding?" "It is, Your Honor." Then Harrington looked directly at Ray. This was the moment. The formal plea. The microphone hidden in Ray's suit was recording, but so were the official court microphones up on the bench. Every word from here was for the public record. "Sir," the judge began, his tone taking on a false, formal kindness. "You have heard the terms of the agreement. Before I accept your plea, I must ask you a few questions. Do you understand that by pleading guilty, you are giving up your right to a trial by jury?" Ray made his voice soft, hesitant. "Yes, sir." "Do you understand that you are giving up your right to confront the witnesses against you, and your right to remain silent?" "Yes, sir." "Are you pleading guilty freely and voluntarily? Has anyone forced you, or threatened you, to make this plea?" This was the question, the one that mattered. Ray felt the eyes of the room on him. He could feel the judge's expectant stare. He knew the team listening in their van nearby would be holding their breath. He had to say the right thing. He had to lie perfectly. He cleared his throat. "No, sir. No one forced me." "And are you pleading guilty because you are, in fact, guilty of this charge?" This was the hardest part. to say the words out loud in this formal setting to give the judge exactly what he wanted. Ray looked down, letting a long pause hang in the air, making it look like shame. He could practically feel Harrington's impatience growing finally. He looked up, not at the judge, but at a spot on the wall behind him. His voice was flat, dead. "Yes, sir. I am guilty." A look of pure satisfaction settled on Judge Harrington's face. It was quick, but Ray saw it. The man had won. He had taken a plea he had bullied for, from a man he had looked down on, and he had done it all in under 10 minutes. He had cleared his docket and proven his power once again. "Very well," Harrington said, his voice now warm with victory. "The court finds the plea is made knowingly, intelligently, and voluntarily. The plea is accepted." He banged his gavel once. The sound was sharp, final. Crack. "Sentence is imposed as per the agreement. You are remanded to the custody of the sheriff until the probation paperwork is processed, which should be later today. This case is concluded." He gave a small, dismissive wave of his hand. "Next case." It was over. Ray turned, feeling numb. A bailiff stepped forward to lead him out a side door, back toward the holding cells, as was the procedure even for a time-served sentence. As he walked, he didn't look back at the judge. But in his mind, he replayed that moment of satisfaction on Harrington's face. The arrogance of it. For the next few hours, Ray sat in a cold, concrete holding cell with a few other men. He played his part, staring at the wall, saying nothing. He was processed, fingerprinted again for the fake identity, and given a thick packet of probation rules he would never have to follow. Finally, in the late afternoon, a different bailiff opened the cell. "You're free to go. Report to your probation officer within 72 hours. Ray walked out of the courthouse through the public entrance the same way he'd come in. The drizzle had stopped, leaving the streets wet and shiny. He didn't stop walking for 3 blocks, following a pre-planned route. He turned a corner into a quiet parking garage. A plain, gray van was waiting. He knocked twice on the side door. It slid open, and he climbed inside. The van was packed with electronic equipment, glowing with small green and red lights. 2 technicians sat in front of screens. His lawyer was there, now out of her courtroom suit and in a simple sweater. And there was the lead case agent, a man with a tired face and sharp eyes. The agent didn't smile. He just held out his hand. Ray unbuttoned his suit jacket and carefully slipped it off. A technician took it with gloved hands, treating it like evidence, which it was. The lead agent looked at Ray. "You okay?" Ray nodded, letting out a long breath he felt like he'd been holding for weeks. "Yeah, it's done." "Good," the agent said. Then he turned to the technician. "And the audio?" "From his chambers yesterday." The technician put on headphones, clicked a mouse, and found a file. He played a snippet out loud. Judge Harrington's voice, clear as day, filled the small space in the van. "The full weight of this court will come down. I'll make certain of it." The voice didn't sound powerful in here. It sounded small and ugly. The lead agent finally allowed himself a small, grim nod. "That's it," he said quietly. "That's the sound of a career ending." He looked at Ray. "You did good. Now we wait. The real work for us starts now. We have to build an ironclad case around what you brought us." Ray looked out the van's dark window at the courthouse in the distance. For him, the acting was over. But for Judge Harrington, the final act was still to come, and he didn't even know the curtain was about to fall. The weeks after the guilty plea were a strange kind of quiet. For the agent, Ray, life snapped back to its normal rhythm, but it felt different. He was back at his real desk at the FBI office, writing reports, attending meetings. Yet he'd catch himself thinking about the courthouse. The smell of the polish, the sound of that gavel, the look on the judge's face. He'd pick up his kids from school and hug them a little tighter, thinking about all the people whose lives that man had changed with a flick of his wrist. The work was now in the hands of the prosecutors and the analysts, but a part of him was still in that courtroom. Meanwhile, in the federal building, the quiet was one of intense focus. The recording from Ray's wire was the key, but a key needs a strong lock. A team of lawyers and agents worked day and night. They weren't just building a case about one bad day. They were building a case about a pattern, a habit of breaking the law from the bench. They pulled hundreds of Judge Harrington's old cases. They looked for the ones where Black and Latino defendants got sentences 30%, 40%, even 50% longer than white defendants for the same crimes. They searched for the cases where he denied bail for people with clean records, or where he overruled jury recommendations for lighter sentences, almost always for people of color. It was painstaking work. They had to become experts in sentencing guidelines, in local crime statistics. They created charts and graphs that showed lines shooting up for one group and staying flat for another. But charts don't convince a jury of a man's intent. For that, they needed voices. So carefully, quietly, they started to reach out. They found the man who'd been a promising college student before a minor drug possession charge landed him in front of Harrington, who gave him the maximum jail time instead of drug court, derailing his life. They found the single mother who'd lost her home because Harrington set an impossibly high cash bail for a shoplifting charge, leaving her children in foster care for months. They found the older man, a veteran, who'd been verbally torn apart by the judge for asking a simple question about his court-appointed lawyer. Getting these people to talk was hard. They were scared. They had moved on or tried to. The courthouse was a place of trauma for them. They didn't trust the system, and why should they? It had crushed them. The agents had to be gentle, patient. They'd meet in quiet libraries or neutral coffee shops, not in government offices. They'd listen for hours before ever asking for a formal statement. Slowly, the stories came out. Not just facts, but feelings, the shame, the anger, the crushing feeling of being powerless before a man in a robe who looked at them and saw only a problem to be disposed of. Each story was a piece of the puzzle. The recording of the threat was the centerpiece, but these stories built the picture around it. They showed this wasn't a mistake or a bad mood. It was a practice, a way of doing business. Back in his own world, Judge Harrington was enjoying what he felt was a successful stretch. He'd cleared that bothersome fraud case quickly. He gave a speech at a local business luncheon about judicial efficiency. He played in his charity golf tournament, smiling for pictures. In his courtroom, nothing changed. The two-faced machine kept running. He'd praise a young white man for taking accountability before giving him probation, and moments later, lecture a black teenager about generational failure before sending him to a juvenile detention center. He slept well at night, believing he was the one keeping order. He had no idea that a file with his name on it was growing thicker by the day. He didn't know that federal agents had spoken to his former clerks, who'd finally confessed their discomfort in whispered conversations. He didn't know that the patterns of his decisions were now color-coded on a huge spreadsheet in a locked room. The federal prosecutors decided they had enough. They had the smoking gun recording of the threat to Ray. They had the statistical analysis showing stark racial disparities. They had the powerful, painful witness statements. They took it all to a federal grand jury, a group of ordinary citizens who hear evidence in secret to decide if there's enough for a trial. For 2 days, the grand jury listened. They heard the clean, digital audio of the judge's voice making his threat. They saw the charts. And they heard from one of the witnesses, the single mother, who sat and cried as she described what it felt like to have a judge look right through her, to call her a bad parent in front of everyone, and to take her children away because she was poor and black. It wasn't just about numbers anymore. It was about people. The vote was unanimous. The grand jury issued an indictment. It was a stack of papers charging Judge Everett Harrington with multiple federal crimes. Deprivation of civil rights under color of law, which is a fancy way of saying using his official power to violate people's constitutional rights to fair treatment. They also charged him with obstruction of justice for forcing an innocent man to plead guilty to clear his docket. A date was set. The arrest would happen in a way that minimized spectacle but sent a clear message. They wouldn't drag him out of his home in pajamas for the cameras. They would do it at his place of work, the throne room where he'd felt so powerful. They would let the courthouse itself see its own justice at work. The lead agent called Ray into his office. "It's tomorrow," he said simply. "We're bringing him in. You've done your part. You can stand down." Ray thought about it. He thought about the guilty plea, the feeling of having to say those words. "I'd like to be there," he said. "Not inside, but nearby. I need to see it." The agent studied him, then nodded. He understood. This wasn't just about closing a case file. It was about closing a loop. That night, Judge Harrington had dinner with his wife. He talked about a difficult case he'd handled that day, complaining about a defendant who'd been disrespectful. He went to bed early, ready for another day of what he called cleaning up the streets. He was, in his own mind, a good judge, a strong judge. The last thought that crossed his mind before sleep was about the golf tournament's success. He never heard the whisper of the net closing tight around him. The morning they came for Judge Harrington started like any other. The sun was bright, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. People in suits and people in worried, everyday clothes streamed up the wide stairs, all heading into the machine of justice, inside his private chambers. The judge was in a good mood. He hummed a little as he adjusted his bow tie in the mirror. A sharp maroon one today. He reviewed his docket sheet. A few sentencings, a few motions. Routine. He sipped his coffee, the expensive kind he had shipped in from a special place, and felt the calm authority of his world. Today, he would give a lecture to a young man about choices. He would be firm but fair. He believed he was always fair. At that same moment, a few blocks away, Ray stood by a window in a federal office building, looking toward the courthouse. He wasn't in his disguise anymore. He wore a simple button-down shirt and slacks. He didn't have to play a part today. He just had to watch. A few other agents from the team were there with him, but no one spoke much. There was a quiet tension in the room. After all the planning, the waiting, the building of the case, it all came down to this moment. Would the judge run? Would he shout? Would he try to use his last bits of power to bully the agents? 2. Back at the courthouse, Judge Harrington finished his coffee and put on his black robe. He liked the weight of it on his shoulders. Felt like armor. He swept out of his chambers and into the bustling hallway, nodding at clerks who quickly said, "Good morning, Your Honor." He entered his courtroom from the back door behind the bench. The bailiff called out and everyone rose. He sat. He was in command. The first case was called. A young man, scared, was up for sentencing on a burglary charge. Harrington looked over the file. The public defender, a woman who often looked tired, pleaded for a chance at rehabilitation, for drug treatment instead of prison. The judge listened, his face showing nothing. "Your record is not good," Harrington said to the young man, who couldn't meet his eyes. "This court has given chances before. You seem intent on throwing your life away." He was about to pronounce a harsh sentence, the kind he believed taught a lesson. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words never came. The heavy door at the back of the courtroom, the one that led to the judge's private hallways, opened quietly. It wasn't supposed to open during session. Everyone turned. 2 men in dark, serious suits walked in, followed by the court's head marshal, whose face was pale and stiff. They walked purposefully down the side aisle, not toward the defendant, but toward the bench. Judge Harrington frowned, irritated by the interruption. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the suddenly silent room. The young defendant at the podium just stared. The lead agent, the one with the tired eyes, reached the gate that separated the public from the court officials. The bailiff, confused, looked at the marshal, who gave a slight nod. The agent opened the gate and walked right up to the wooden bench. He had to look up at the judge. "Judge Everett Harrington?" the agent said, his voice calm but clear. Every person in the gallery was leaning forward, not breathing. "Obviously," the judge snapped, his face flushing with anger. "You are disrupting my courtroom. Identify yourself immediately or I will have you held in contempt." The agent didn't flinch. He reached into his inner jacket pocket. He pulled out a wallet, flipping it open to show a gold badge. "Special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." He put the badge away and pulled out a folded sheaf of papers. "I have a federal warrant for your arrest. You are charged with multiple counts of deprivation of civil rights under color of law and obstruction of justice." For a long second, there was no sound at all. The judge just stared. His mind, so quick with legal arguments, seemed to freeze. The words didn't make sense. Arrest? Him? It was a joke. A terrible mistake. "This is absurd." He finally sputtered, but his voice had lost its power. Sounded thin, confused. "There is some error." "There's no error, sir," the agent said, his voice still low, meant only for the judge and those nearby. "The indictment is based on, among other things, a recorded interaction you had with a defendant in this very chambers. You are to come with us now." The word recorded did it. Judge Harrington's eyes, for just a flash, went to the door of his chambers. Then they went to the agent's face, searching for a lie. He saw none. He saw only cold certainty. And in that moment, the tower of his confidence began to crack. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly gray. The maroon bow tie seemed suddenly garish, foolish. The head marshal stepped forward, his voice filled with pity and embarrassment. "Your Honor, Judge Harrington, it's best if you come quietly. We can go out the back." The judge looked out at his courtroom. He saw the shocked faces of the lawyers, the stunned clerks. He saw the young defendant at the podium, whose expression had changed from fear to something else, a kind of stunned wonder. The judge's armor was gone. He was just a man in a costume. He stood up slowly, his movements robotic. He seemed smaller without the power of the bench propping him up. He didn't look at anyone as he walked, stiff-legged, through the door behind his throne, the 2 FBI agents and the marshal flanking him. The bailiff, after a stunned moment, turned to the gaping courtroom and said, "Court is adjourned. Everyone please clear the room." From the window across town, Ray saw the unmarked cars pull away from the courthouse's secure basement entrance. He couldn't see the judge inside them, but he knew. He let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for months. Next to him, one of the younger agents clapped him softly on the shoulder. There were no cheers. Felt too serious for that. The news spread through the city like a shockwave. A judge? Arrested? By the FBI? The local news stations broke into their programming. People talked about it in coffee shops and on buses. For many, especially those in communities who had long distrusted the courthouse, there was a feeling of cautious, unbelievable relief. It wasn't just gossip anymore. Someone had finally been held to account. In the weeks that followed, the judge resigned. His expensive lawyers fought, but when they heard the recording, when they saw the mountain of evidence, they advised him to plead guilty. The story of the operation came out piece by piece. How the FBI had sent an agent to be the perfect target. How the judge had taken the bait, just as they knew he would the sentencing. Several of the people he had wronged were allowed to speak. They faced him not as a judge but as a defendant in a cheap suit. They told him what his efficiency had cost them. Their families, their hopes, their faith. He did not look at them. He stared at the floor. He was sentenced to serve time in a federal prison, a place far removed from the wood-paneled chambers and the respect he had once known. Ray never went back to that courthouse. He moved on to other cases, but sometimes on a quiet afternoon he would think about it. He didn't think about the judge often. He thought about the people in the gallery that day, the ones who saw the arrest. He thought about the young man at the podium who was given a second chance with a new judge. He thought about the single mother who got her children back, and the veteran who finally felt someone had listened. The system was still big and it was still flawed, but for a moment, a crack had been opened. A little light had gotten in, and for the people who had been living in the shadow of that bench, that light made all the difference. It wasn't about revenge. It was about balance. The gavel, for once, had fallen on the right side.